Well, now that we finished talking about the three major divisions of the brain, the hindbrain, the forebrain, and we talked briefly about the midbrain too, we learned about what all these different parts of the brain do and what they're associated with, but how do they actually communicate with each other? How does all of this stuff work? Well, let me tell you about a little thing called the nervous system. The nervous system is how all these different parts of the brain interact. And the nervous system can be broken down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is very easy to understand. It is what connects our brain to our spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system is what connects our muscles, our organs, and our glands to the central nervous system. And the way these two kind of relate to each other is the peripheral nervous system will take in information from our organs, our muscles, our glands, and it sends it up to the central nervous system. And the central nervous system will interpret the information, process it, and then generate an appropriate response to that information. Now, if we're going to talk about the nervous systems, there's a couple more terms we ought to know about: sensation and perception. Sensation is just the stimulation of our sensory receptors. If we touch something, that's a sensation. If our stomach is growling, that is a sensation. And all of this stuff gets transmitted from the peripheral system to the central nervous system, and it is then interpreted. And that process of it making its way up to the central nervous system to be interpreted is what is known as transduction. Now, perception, on the other hand, is a little bit more subjective. It's unique to each person, because perception is the actual process of interpreting all these different stimuli, all the different sensations, and this is what forms our inner representations of the world, our perceptions of the world, based off of the sensations that we experience. So now that we've learned a little bit about the major divisions of the brain and the different nervous systems, how does this all work? How does it all tie together? Well, let's take a closer look and go all the way down to the cellular level and figure out how these things all communicate. So on my whiteboard here, I have a very scientifically accurate depiction of what's known as a neuron. A neuron is a type of cell, and they are the building blocks of our nervous systems. Neurons are arranged, millions and millions of them, all tied together in big long chains. And what happens is, let's say I go ahead and touch the surface of this table, the neurons in my fingertips, part of my peripheral nervous system. The neurons at the edge, when I touch the table, these little dendrites here, these little squiggly lines, they bend and change shape. And when that happens, it changes the polarization of the neuron. Polarization is essentially the electricity of the neuron. And that change in electricity starts at the dendrite and it travels all the way down to the bottom, this little part here that's known as the synapse. And when that electrical charge reaches the synapse, it releases a chemical, what's known as a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is released from the synapse at the bottom here to the dendrites of the next neuron in the chain. And those dendrites, as a result, bend, they change shape, it changes the polarization of the next neuron. And it sends that little electrical impulse all the way down to the synapse of the next neuron. And that releases another neurotransmitter. It binds with the dendrite of the next neuron, and the process repeats over and over and over until it makes its way from the peripheral nervous system in my fingertips to the central nervous system in my brain, and eventually it will make its way to my parietal lobe, where I can understand that I am touching a table. And that is more or less how a neuron works. Okay, so for this last bit of the video, we're going to take a bit of a pivot and just talk a little bit about genetics and heredity. Now, heredity is basically just the passing down of information from the mother and father of an organism. And genes are the individual units of heredity. Now, genes are organized in what's known as chromosomes. Chromosomes are little intertwined strings that's known as a double helix, a collection of these genes. And the chromosomes all form together to make what's known as our DNA. This is what makes us each a unique person. With the exception of identical twins, everybody has completely unique sets of DNA. Now just as a side note, each cell in an organism has 46 total chromosomes and they're organized in 23 pairs. Okay, so just a couple more terms you're going to need to know for genetics and heredity today. Genotypes and phenotypes. Your genotype is a genetic makeup that makes you predisposed to have certain traits that you see in the real world. And how this genetic makeup kind of manifests is what's known as the phenotype. It's easy to think of it as genotypes are like the blueprint, and phenotypes are the finished product, what we see in the real world. So let's look at an example of eye color. Eye color is a trait that you inherit from your parents. The different genes that you have that determine your eye color is what's known as the genotype, while the eye color itself is the phenotype, because it's an expression of the genotype, an expression of that combination of genes. Well, that's just about all I learned in my introductory psychology class this week. I think next week we'll be going over chapter 4 in our book and learning all about consciousness. It should be a very interesting topic. But for now, let me just take a moment to tell you about an album that I listened to recently. It is called Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Pet Sounds was written and entirely arranged by a single Beach Boy by the name of Brian Wilson. I hope you will all take some time to listen to this album, throw on some headphones, close your eyes, and take in everything it has to offer. I think Pet Sounds may very well be one of the best albums ever made. I hope you get a chance to listen to it, and I hope I'll see you next week.